Welcome to Rethinking Trade with Lori Wallach, a podcast that unpacks international trade and how it affects you without putting you to sleep.
Hello and welcome to Rethinking Trade with Lori Wallach. I'm Lori Wallach. Today we're going to talk about something in the news, the 13th Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization, the WTO. To translate that out of trade jargon, it's the big meeting that happens every couple of years where trade minister level people, like our U.S. Trade Representative Katherine Tai, get together to set the agenda for the global trade and commerce body. This is the decision-making meeting. And today we're really lucky to have joining us Rangel, our research director at Rethinking Trade. He went to Abu Dhabi, which is in the United Arab Emirates, where this meeting was held, and he got to witness the whole thing firsthand, and he's going to debrief us. Rangel came to Rethink Trade from Colombia, where he was working as a trade lawyer. He got a master's degree in international economic policy at Sciences Po, a very fancy and famous school in Paris. And he has an LLM from Georgetown Law School, so he's a U.S. lawyer too. He's a very smart guy with a lot of degrees, and we're super lucky to have him on the ground. Rangel, welcome to Rethinking Trade.
Thank you for having me here.
So you were there at this meeting, and just coincidentally, we're hitting the beginning of the 25th year after the famous protests against the Seattle Ministerial of the WTO. That was an epic fight where an attempt to expand the World Trade Organization's agenda to impose even more constraints on governments and pro-worker, pro-environment policies was foiled by both countries' negotiators on the inside in the suites and activists out in the streets in Seattle. How was this ministerial, given this is the big moment where the countries get together and decide what the future of the WTO's agenda is going to be? Did the WTO get back in its feet? I mean, it hasn't really sort of gained its momentum since that Seattle butt kicking.
In a way, this was an anticlimactic WTO ministerial because many of the objectives that were drawn and that they were heavily pushed by the Director-General of the organization were not actually met. Particularly, a lot of people pay attention to the fact that maybe almost half of the world is going into elections this year, and that definitely affected the capacity of the WTO to deliver on new deals. But taking a step back, it's important to take into account that many of the priorities from both developing countries, but also from critical voices of the WTO for years, were not part of the agenda. And the lack of agreement and the lack of tangible outcomes is also related to that.
So you mentioned the Director General of the WTO, and that's supposed to be a role that facilitates what the member countries do to work together. But the place is supposed to be basically run by the member countries, and the Director General just helps make sure they get to negotiate together to good outcomes. But this Director General has really been trying to set the agenda, and to some degree, some people argue her trying to set the agenda is why when the members got together, they didn't actually agree on her agenda. What was her agenda, and then what actually happened?
Well, I think that in the multilateral front, there were two issues that were heavily pushed by the DG and that people kind of expected that were going to have a lot of attention during the Ministerial Conference. First is the fisheries subsidies agreement. There was a first part of the agreement that was negotiated and concluded in 2022, and the Director General really expected for a second part of the agreement to be concluded in this ministerial. The second important item on the agenda was related to agriculture and food, and basically the discussion here is whether countries are allowed to have programs in which governments support farmers in buying their products and then give those products to people for anti-hunger programs, and also the objective to reduce subsidies for agricultural producers in rich countries. The third important item that was being discussed and high in the agenda of the DG It's called the Investment Facilitation Agreement, and was basically this negotiation that started a few years ago that will give benefits and privileges to foreign investors to participate in every step of the rulemaking of regulations or authorizations for investment projects, and also will give them rights to be treated in a fair manner, which after years of investor state dispute settlement cases, we know that that's problematic, and we know how it could affect government's ability to regulate in an effective manner.
So it sounds like there were two things she wanted to do that, depending on what happened, could have been okay, and one thing that was really bad. So what ended up happening with that agenda as far as the actual outcome of the big conference?
So, regarding fisheries, the first deal that was negotiated in 2022 targeted illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And basically, those subsidies that will contribute to those activities are banned. Then, the second part of the deal was more ambitious. And the idea here was to prohibit or limit subsidies that contribute to overfishing and overcapacity. So, after an entire week of negotiations, late in the Friday evening, when the Ministerial Conference was already extended for 24 hours, Indian Trade Minister Piyush Goyal came out of the negotiating table and he started talking to reporters. And he hinted that lack of agreement in this specific case was due to developing countries thinking that rich countries were not carrying their own weight. Basically, developing countries will be the ones that had to limit the kind of support that they could give to their own fleets, while the countries that have the largest fleets, which include China, Russia, EU countries, and the US, will not be forced to make substantial cuts.
So that didn't sound like it would be an outcome that would be reasonable. So in that way, it sounds like the developing countries kind of saved the day.
Exactly. Many people in the developing world celebrated the fact that this agreement was not accepted in the terms that were proposed for MC13, and now the countries, the negotiators, have to go back to Geneva and reach a better agreement that actually contributes to the protection of our fisheries and that has a more equitable impact.
So the context of that fisheries agreement is that there are so many of these huge industrial fishing fleets that like hoover up all the fish. And local fishermen who are basically providing the protein for a lot of people in developing countries are finding that the fisheries are collapsing, which is to say, that's a technical way of saying there are no more fish and people are going to go hungry. So getting the subsidy stuff right to try and have those factory fishing fleets not sucking up all the fish seems really important. So whatever you think about the rich country versus poor country angle on this, it seems like if what was on the table wasn't going to stop the hoovering up of all the fish, then that was a good outcome that that version of the rules didn't get set. I guess it now depends if we're going to get like a version of it that actually stops the bad behavior when they go back to Geneva. How about on agriculture and food? What happened there?
So, on agriculture and food, the main question here, and this was driven by India, was whether there will be a permanent solution for what is technically called public stockholding programs. As I said, these are basically systems by which a government buys agricultural goods from farmers at a fair price and then distribute them among the poorest population. Millions of people in India depend on this program. But some big agri-exporter countries claim that this system distorts trade and are opposed to completely accepting them from the WTO rules. Also, South American agri-exporter countries point out that comprehensive negotiations on agriculture were supposed to start after the WTO agreement was adopted in 1994. Developing countries with huge capacity to export food and ag products believe they draw the short straw during the Uruguay round negotiations, and while they gave up on using certain policy tools, the US and the European countries were able to keep their huge agricultural subsidies. So they will only accept dealing with India's demand related to the public stockholding programs if a comprehensive agreement on agriculture will start. But this was unacceptable for India and Indonesia and some of its allies. So at the end of the day, there was no agreement on agriculture, and this is another matter that goes back to Geneva.
Wow. Okay. And then how about that investment facilitation business? Now, I understand China was actually pushing that agreement. The US wasn't participating in it, but a bunch of other WTO countries were. But that it wasn't actually a straight up kosher WTO agreement. It was kind of like a side thing. I'm confused. And it sounds like some of the rules in there smelled a little bit like the foreign investor privileges we've seen attached to investor state dispute settlement, which basically like would handcuff governments from being able to direct foreign investment to meet policy goals. What's the story there?
Well, the story with investment and the WTO is almost like a toxic relationship. Some people have tried to include investment into the WTO since the 2000s. But the thing is that the WTO and protections for foreign investors really shouldn't be together. Several countries that are worried of these kind of compromises, particularly considering the issues that we have seen through bilateral investment treaties and free trade agreements that have investment chapters. So, after decades of this standoff, a group of countries decided that they were going to bypass the consensus rule at the WTO, and they will just launch what they are called joint statement initiatives, which are basically negotiations and talks that don't involve all of the WTO members. The negotiations on investment facilitation went on for some years, and eventually a text was agreed by around 120 countries, but this was mainly led by China. The agreement gives some rights to foreign investors to comment on rulemaking related to investment regulation, and also it has some standards for governments to give investors fair treatment. This is awfully close to the kind of rules that we have seen in investor state dispute settlement. So a lot of people are concerned about how this agreement is going to be a way for China to push governments into accepting more investment in problematic terms and not doing anything about it. Fortunately, there are countries that do not agree with this idea of having non-mandated negotiations at the WTO, like South Africa and India, and they stood their ground throughout the ministerial and did not agree with including this investment facilitation deal as an official WTO agreement.
So that seems like good news for the world. Way back, one of the things on the agenda for the 1999 Seattle WTO Ministerial was literally to put investor state dispute settlements, the old, most extreme corporate and foreign investor privileges, into the WTO. In parallel, there was a thing called the MIA that was going to be part of the WTO, and the MAI, which was an outside negotiation to get the same rules, and civil society working with the governments around the world tanked both of those. So this sounds like that was a part of that old agenda sneaking up and getting smacked down. And I had heard they were bullying a lot of countries to basically shut up and go along with China's plan, sort of playing the game that normally the US and the EU do, but this time it's China's the big investor around the world bullying the smaller countries. What happens when that goes back to Geneva?
It's uncertain. Definitely, China and its allies in this agreement are going to try to get it adopted as an official plurilateral agreement at the WTO. But the fact that ministers at the Ministerial Conference stopped that strategy and in a decided way actually puts the deal in a limbo. It will be ideal that it stays there, but it's still a little bit uncertain what's going to happen about this.
Interesting. So, what other things were the big takeaways? There was some discussion that was supposed to happen about reforming the dispute settlement system at the WTO. And as a little background to that, there had been growing unhappiness through the Obama administration, the Trump administration, now the Biden administration about the World Trade Organization's enforcement tribunals really overstepping. They're supposed to just interpret and enforce the rules that countries signed up for. and not write new rules, but they had started to basically create stuff out of whole cloth and tell the countries this is what the new rules were. So the previous administration kind of cleverly stopped appointing judges. And without the judges, you can't get the final decisions. Without the final decisions, you can't get the enforcement sanctions. This administration, U.S. Trade Representative Katherine Tai, stuck to that. And her principle has been, let's fix the rules, and then we can talk about how we should go forward with enforcement. But until we have the enforcement rules more fairly operating, let's not basically give a sharp set of teeth to this system. And what happened with all of that?
In the last ministerial in 2022, the member countries of the WTO agreed that they will fix the dispute settlement system by 2024, this year. That didn't seem to be achievable until last year. An informal process was launched and was directed by the Guatemalan delegation, and it made some progress, and it tried to get different countries' views to reach an agreement in which the dispute settlement system will be restored completely and it be improved considering what was going on before. And the problem is that the Guatemalan delegate that was in charge of this process suddenly got canned weeks before the Ministerial Conference, and that left the dispute settlement reform process basically without its main proponent. Now, a lot of developing countries also complain that this informal process is not inclusive and that their views are not being taken into account in the conversation. So when we got into the MC13, there was a lot of concern about what this informal process that produced a 60-page document that was unknown for many delegations, and that generated a lot of discomfort among the people that didn't participate in those conversations. Eventually, that led to that document not being formally endorsed by the ministers, but still, the ministers made the commitment that they hope to get to a solution by the end of 2024.
So this whole process was kind of interesting, and I've been watching it a little bit because the approach they were taking was what they called interest-based negotiations. This was the process that Guatemalan guy was using, and instead of the usual WTO process where each country or certain blocks of countries bring in positions, lay them on the table, and then basically fight a war to keep their version, this was a lot of discussion about what is your goal. And then they were trying to come up with common interests and then from scratch develop language together. It's kind of based on a theory called getting to yes that has been a sort of a competing methodology for negotiations. And it seemed like they had made some amount of progress in at least identifying some of the things that everyone agreed needed to be fixed as compared to spending all their time hollering at each other. Do we think that that's going to pick up again in Geneva when the negotiators return back to the regular WTO everyday business, or what happens next?
This is definitely a priority for the Secretariat and for most WTO countries. So we should expect that the conversations continue when the delegations get back to Geneva. The big question is who is going to lead this process and how the views of the countries that felt excluded are gonna be included into the conversation so that when there's an agreement that actually leads to something that is acceptable to most countries, the countries that have felt excluded don't block it.
Besides the dispute settlement issue, another thing that got a lot of press at this ministerial was what got called in shorthand the e-commerce moratorium. And what that represents officially, that the title of that negotiation is the WTO's moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. And it basically forbids WTO countries from putting customs duties, i.e. tariffs, border taxes, on quote unquote electronic transmissions. Now, that's a really thorny topic because there's a lot of ambiguity. What exactly is an electronic transmission? So it used to be like if you bought a game or music or software, you purchased a disc that you put into your computer and you downloaded it, or you basically had some physical thing that you bought that was the carrier of the content. Now a lot of that content is streamed and you don't actually have the physical thing anymore. So it's a whole area of commerce that's very, very busy, where countries under these rules of no charges are waiving what would normally be a stream of income. So a lot of developing countries don't want to lose that money. On the other hand, there is at the WTO a general inclination to cutting border charges, tariffs. And so that's a sort of history of that. But as more and more stuff is conveyed electronically that you would have bought in a physical form, then what happens as far as government's revenue sources? So it's a big sticky thicket. And there has been every 2 years an extension of this thing. There is no permanent rule on it. And this seems like it was really coming to a boil. Like when I was reading the news, it looked like the whole dang ministerial almost blew up over this issue. So what was actually happening?
Well, the thing is that if you look at trade press, they have tried to paint the issue of the e-commerce moratorium, which is basically the ability of countries to charge customs duties on electronic transmissions, or it could even cover digitally delivered services or goods, as a negotiating chip used by India to make progress on their demands in other issues unrelated to e-commerce. But that doesn't recognize that around 8 WTO members vocally explained their concerns about the moratorium during MC13. These members include important WTO members such as Pakistan, Egypt, and Brazil. So all of these countries consider that the e-commerce moratorium might be an obstacle in their efforts to launch their digital industrialization strategies and to support domestic digital industries. This is the underlying problem here. On the other side, countries like the US or Switzerland have been arguing that imposing tariffs on digital products or electronic transmissions might imply a new burden for small and medium-sized enterprises that will carry the brunt of any new taxes. This is a complicated issue. The underlying question is whether the WTO is going to leave enough room for countries to independently decide what's best for their MSMEs, but also for their industrialization efforts. That's the big question. So the end result regarding the moratorium was that for the first time, countries decided that they will put an end date. The moratorium will expire by March 31st of 2026 or by the next Ministerial Conference, whatever comes first. After that, we're going to see if countries decide or do not decide to adopt new tariffs, or if they just want to have that policy space there for the future.
On the e-commerce moratorium question, on the reform of dispute settlements, on agriculture, on fisheries, on all of these issues, these do not sound like easy missions when everyone gets back to Geneva. In fact, it sounds like the organization is not doing all that well as a negotiating body. Is that your take overall?
Yes, I agree with that. I think that the main issue that we're facing right now is that after years of criticism of the WTO for overreaching, some interests included within the Secretariat think that the answer to that disease is more WTO overreaching and the same agenda. So I think that that's the outcome of this ministerial proves that that's not going to be the fix. In order for the WTO to improve and to become a more relevant body of international global cooperation, it needs to reassess what the priorities are. And in many ways, it has to step back and recognize that the world that we're living in today is not the same world that in which it was formed in 1994.
So, in your view, what should happen next? I think a lot of countries and a lot of civil society and labor unions have thought the WTO wasn't a very great idea in the first instance, with all of its one-size-fits-all rules when it was hatched in 1995. It is aging even less well over time, seeing how it's played out. So we do need some kind of global trade rules for the actual trade part. What do you think should happen next?
In a multipolar world, pushing for further trade liberalization and harmonization of the rules is probably not the answer. There needs to be more leeway for countries to actually figure out what's the best policy for themselves and maybe arrange regional groupings in which they actually can achieve some common rules based on shared values. The whole idea that an organization of 166 members now is going to be able to have uniform rules for the entire world is a little bit too ambitious. And it was ambitious in 1994, it's even more ambitious in 2024.
That sounds just about right. Not that I want you, Danielle, to leave our team and go run the WTO, but I don't know. You might have the right way forward, but don't go anywhere. We need you here. So everybody, whatever rules happen at the WTO, actually, they're binding on countries. All countries, as a reminder, are required to conform their domestic laws to these rules. So this actually matters to all of us. And that is why we basically took the time to let Daniel share with us everything his big brain absorbed on the ground at this huge policy setting meeting of the global trade rules, the WTO. And we're very appreciative that we got this front row view of what happened and maybe what should come next. Thank you very much, Danielle Rangel. And for all of our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. This is Lori Wallach signing off. Until next time.